Welcome to this episode of the Below the Surface podcast. Today we're talking to Pierina Otness. She's a senior toxicologist at the Western Australian Department of Health. And the reason why we chose to talk to Pierina is because she is intimately involved with policy development and guidelines development surrounding asbestos in soil. The Western Australian guidelines that she has helped develop and has all her fingerprints are all over it, they have formed the basis of what has become national guidance in Australia. And when we refer to the NEPM, we talk about the National Environmental Protection Measures. So don't worry, we are not going to talk a lot about asbestos. We've done that in earlier episodes. In this one, we focus on what is the research behind the National Environmental Protection Measures and what papers were used to come up with those guidelines. What are the pros and the cons of those papers? We also get a little bit into a deeper explanation and clarification of how asbestos in soils should be assessed, but don't worry, it's not going to be a lot. We talk a little bit about the zero tolerance for asbestos in waste in New South Wales and how Western Australia is trying to handle that. We then also talk briefly about how tough it actually is to get properly educated in the subject of asbestos in soils in Australia and in particular here in New South Wales, where James and I sit. And right at the end, we're trying to convince Pierina to leave Western Australia, grab her family and move over to New South Wales so she can do the awesome work that she's doing over here. By the way, this is the third time we are recording our interview with Pierina. We had one was a false start. The second was a very long interview we did, and it just shows that James and I are not very experienced in podcasting yet, because although we had a great time, but we created quite a mess, and it was an almost unpublishable, or it was actually unpublishable, that recording. So Pierina was very nice and agreed to do a third recording with us. So this is the one that you're going to be hearing now. So when we refer back to previous recordings, that's where that comes from. I couldn't help, but I had to leave some banter in just before we spoke to Pierina for the very first time, and you will hear that right at the beginning. So here it goes. Our chat with Pierina. Listen in. It's a good one. Recording has started. I have a question for you.
Sure.
Do you ever introduce yourself as Hammond, James Hammond?
I can't say that I have, no.
And this is like, man, this is an opportunity here. I don't know why you don't.
If I had a last name that rhymed,
so much better than Hyde, Gunnar Hyde. It doesn't have the ring, right? But my name is Hammond, James Hammond. Watch this. I'm going to introduce you to Pierina, like that.
Oh, man. I'm not as cool as James Bond.
No, but...
Not as suave.
Hey, there's an opportunity for you. I mean, nothing... Did you not do it when you met Dee? How did you meet Dee, your wife?
We met in stats class, actually. You'd appreciate that, Gunnar.
Oh, come on, that is just boring.
I know. Well, that's
really?
The thing. The class was so boring. We had other things that we could focus on.
Oh, okay.
It was quite... no, honestly, though, it was quite serendipitous, right? As these things are. I was in a different class to her, and I didn't like the teacher or something, I can't remember. And so I actually switched classes a few weeks into the semester and just happened to join the class that she was at, and that's where we met.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then the rest is history.
Serendipitous it was. Look, I can understand. Whoever has met your wife will understand that you did absolutely the right thing. I still don't understand what was going on with her, but hey. Hey, before we go any further into your dating life, I can see that Pierina is waiting for us. Are you ready? I'll let her in.
Good morning.
Well, good morning.
How are you?
Good.
Pierina, this is Hammond, James Hammond.
Good morning.
How are you?
How are you? I'm sorry. We had a bit of a banter before before you came. Never mind. It's all good. I asked him if he ever introduces himself as Hammond, James Hammond.
All right.
And he said, "No, I don't." I said, "Watch this. I'm gonna introduce you to Pierina like that."
And I said, Gunnar, I'm not suave enough for that sort of an introduction. I can't pull it off.
I think you're fine.
Well, let's try this again. Well, this is the third time, right?
Third time. The first time we didn't get far at all.
It was a false start. We can't count that one, Gunnar.
Well, hopefully this one will be the better one, and you can just use this one without any edits.
That's right. So last time we were all over the place. This is not necessarily your fault. We are still young at this, and I have entire sessions with guests who I then have to go back and say, guys, I can't publish this. This was just terrible. I don't say terrible, but it's not publishable. It's look, when we compete with the Joe Rogans and the of this world, I'll have a producer who will rein us in. Until then, it's just James and me.
Well, I felt I tried to pack too much in, and it became unwieldy.
So Gunnar and I, we've had a chat, and we've kind of dialed it back, I think, to just a few key areas that we're really keen to speak to you about.
Mm-hmm. Sounds great. Yeah, you guys know what you're doing.
Well, obviously not. Otherwise, we wouldn't have to re-record, right?
That was my very first podcast. So I guess we're all on a learning curve.
Do you mind telling us what was going on in your life when you said you had things going on, or is it too private a question?
Well, to do with dealing with children that like to have a high level of drama in their life and introduce it into mine.
Oh, James, you are an expert on that one.
How old are your kids, Pierina?
Teenagers, so the drama's at a whole other level.
So a little bit different. I've got 3 under 3, and you've got teenagers, so like just different kinds of drama, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's a bit better.
I at some stage had 3 girls in private school. That adds a completely different drama to your life, I can promise you.
Well, I don't even want to imagine.
Yeah, $90,000 a year of school fees. I'm like, how do I make this much money? No wonder I'm broke.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, you either have kids or you have money. You don't have both.
Well, I hope it's all going a bit, okay now, Pierina.
Yeah. It's still dramas, but not this morning of the podcast, which is.
So, Pierina, tell us how you got involved into being involved in the NEPM.
Well, I didn't really get involved in the NEPM. I guess it was in early 2000s. We were looking for a soil investigation level because the environmental legislators wanted to nominate asbestos as a contaminant under the contaminated sites legislation here in WA. And at the time, I was working in government, and I drafted up the NHealth document, which fell short of setting a guideline on the basis. Then I felt we didn't have sufficient analytical techniques to be able to go anything below 0.01. That was the qualitative kind of limit of reporting for the then proposed Australian standard. It hadn't even come out yet.
What year was that?
That was late 90s, early 2000 that I did the first draft. But I left the health department after I drafted. It went through a couple of iterations after I left before it was published. And I was back into being a hygienist and dealing with asbestos in the workplace. And then when I came back, it was John Howell over here in WA that had developed the guidance that we have now, the 2009 guidance.
So I need to say, when we mention the NEPM, I have some of my friends who listen to the podcast they listen to it because they're nice to me, and they say, look, you throw acronyms around it that nobody knows. I'm like, well, people do know. But when we say NEPM, that's the National Environmental Protection Measures. that is the only national document that tries to bring it all together and say, hey, this is how you assess contaminated sites. This is how you remediate contaminated sites. This is how laboratories have to behave. And these are the methods they have to do. These are the quality control measures we have to put in place. So this is basically our user manual in our industry.
The Bible as such.
Yeah, okay. The Bible is way more multiple choice than the NEP.
Fair enough.
So the first version of the WA guidance around assessing asbestos contamination, was that prior to the NEPM, or was it developed after? It was prior to.
I believe it was prior to the NEPM having asbestos in it.
Right.
When I came back into this field, I noted that the 2009 guidelines were referenced in that part of the NEPM that talked about asbestos.
Yeah, it takes very heavily from the WA guidance, for sure.
Yeah, it references them and say, if in doubt, please talk to Pierina. Basically, that's what it says, right?
Yeah, initially John and then me, yes.
So hence you're here. So can we, when we keep talking about asbestos, can we stick to the bonded versions only? Because this is what most of us consultants come across. The friable, which is the truly dangerous bit, friable being the one that do have a high risk of releasing respirable fibers into the air and then causing some serious harm. That's one version. I don't want to talk about that because that's a fringe event in the assessment of contaminated sites, or a rare one. Let's put it that way. It does happen, but rather rarely. While the bonded one is a complete and utter stock standard event when you come across bonded asbestos in soils on any site assessment here.
Most common.
Is it the same in New South Wales, or is it in WA? Hey, here is another WA, Western Australia, or here in New South Wales. For our international guests, but look, so can we stick to the bonded one? And then you got in, so that's how you ended up being an authority, basically, when it comes to asbestos in any medium. So then we ended up with some acceptable concentrations of asbestos, of bonded asbestos in soils, and they are entrenched in the NEPM, in the National Environmental Protection Measures, which is a little bit more than a guideline. That is a regulatory instrument, which is good and bad at some stage, because good as in it truly means, hey, this is part of the law. Bad because it becomes extremely difficult to modify or update. In science, it's fairly simple to correct a paper or to present a paper and then present follow-up data and correct or update things. Once you have a regulatory instrument, it gets really tough to update things.
Yeah, I felt that when I was trying to update the 2021 guidelines, that I was somewhat then bound by what we had come up with in 2009 because it had been adopted into the NEPM. And so the updates that I could make to the 2021 guidelines were limited by that.
Yeah. There is two key papers that are constantly referenced in the legislation. Those two papers are a 1998 or 1999 paper from Addison. And then there is a Dutch author. I asked a Dutch friend of mine how to pronounce his name. Let me get this right. Zwartjes is his name. Zwartjes. Is this how you pronounce that? So, okay. Zwartjes and Trump, that's the second paper that everybody always quotes.
Yes.
So that's already a bit of an issue. So we have legislation here in Australia that's based on two papers.
Yes.
Can you run us through the pros and cons of both of those papers? Start with Addison.
Okay, so Addison was around when I first started to look at investigation levels. These two papers are important because they both attempt to try and do exactly what it was that we were looking for, which is try and set a practical limit of asbestos in soil based on what could end up in the air, because really when asbestos goes into the air is when it can cause harm. So that was why they were important, because they actually tried to relate it back to a sort of risk-based investigation level in soil, exactly what we were looking for. Addison's paper focuses on that friable material, which is, as you say, less common. And it found a level of 0.001% in soil could be a problem in dry soil if it was friable. So it wasn't until Swartz and Tromp that somebody really pulled together the data that there was on the more bonded type material and what can be released into air. They generally found that you won't really get much in air from bonded material. So they set their original limit of 0.01% on the basis that this non-friable material will over time become friable and become dangerous. So, from the NEPM that we've been talking about, when we set health screening levels, we set them very conservatively. And we say, look, if it's below this level, you don't need to do anything because it won't present a health risk. So that's why they chose the most conservative option of, well, let's imagine that all this bonded material becomes friable, and then we'll set a limit for that. In the 0.01% that they came up with, when John was looking at it for WA, he noted that their calculation for 0.01% meant that they gave like a 1-to-1 amount for white asbestos, which is less dangerous. But the amount for 0.01 included a 10 times factor if you had crucidolite, blue asbestos, which is more dangerous. Now, because we have crucidolite in WA in older asbestos products, and because we have very dry soils, which, Netherlands assumes that they have about 10% moisture in their soils, which is a mitigating factor, we decided that it's probably, if we follow the same sort of conservative approach, we probably need to look at the 0.001% in WA.
So that's 10 times as strict.
Yes, because of not accounting for crucidolite separately, because we treat them all the same in Australia, and because we have very dry soils.
That is we are going back away from the bonded material.
Yes, correct. We're assuming all of that bonded material has become friable. And if you read the Swartz and Tromp paper, they then say, look, you have to go through the next tier assessment. Once you find bonded, you can basically, their next tier of assessment is not any more sampling, but a qualitative approach. Okay, so we found bonded. So from a qualitative assessment approach, we can maybe multiply that, which we've kind of done automatically by saying if it's bonded, you can go 10 times better to 0.01% in our guidelines. So we've done a bit of that qualitative assessment step for you. Yeah, and then there's the next tiers of, what are your soil characteristics? What is the nature and distribution of the contamination? How likely is it that this is going to become damaged, very dusty, airborne, and have people exposed to it?
Okay, so in summary, the Addison paper deals with friable asbestos mainly. I've read the paper, and my first thought was, nicely done, except for that the methodology they used with drying soil, placing them into a chamber and blowing compressed air through it, as nice as that is as a laboratory experiment. I'm thinking, okay, at what stage do we leave reality behind in this research, right? Because even driving over this kind of soil with an excavator on a construction site is way less likely to release fibers than when you blow compressed air through it.
Yes.
But okay, they've done the research, and that's fine. Yes, then we go to Swartz and Tromp, and their tier, and I would call them steps, right? Their tiers are okay. And here's the problem, though. These tiers that they have, they say when you find something at a certain concentration, that's when you need to look further.
Yes.
Which is very similar to all the other health investigation levels we have in the NEPM, where they say, hey, that's just a tier 1. That doesn't mean remediation is required. That doesn't mean this is a hazardous site. It means you need to investigate further. But what tends to happen in our industry is the next step where people say, okay, now we need to look further, that just gets skipped.
Yes.
And the moment you exceed a level that is in the NEPM, the moment that happens, and no matter how often it says that, don't do that, do not use those tier 1 levels as triggers for remediation, it gets done because it's rather simple, easy to do. It's a very streamlined and time-saving approach. And if I may add so, it also allows for a pretty much black and white approach to it, which consultants like, because if you can write it in 2 lines of code, if concentration less than my health investigation level, I'm fine. If greater, I need to do more work, or, God forbid, start thinking.
Yes, I agree. There's a reluctance to start thinking about it. I think the reason why I'm here today is because I was doing contaminated site investigation reviews as part of my work here, and exactly what you're saying was happening. People would find even just one hit of asbestos at very low concentration, and they didn't know what to do about that. They didn't want to do the next steps, so they just said, look, it's just this little spot here. Let's just dig it out and take it away. And when they present that to me as a solution, I just go, yeah, fine. It's conservative, but fine, no problem. Tick, pass, sites, classified as decontaminated.
Yeah.
And so I had no issue with that until I started reading in consultant reports, we found this little tiny amount here in, a metre down underground, and we got a little bit of a hit. This is high risk, so we've got to get rid of it.
Yeah.
And it's friable, so we've got to get rid of it, and we've got to, do these other things. And it's like, well, no, that's you've leapt a number of steps now to get to, and you've created a communication and incorrect conclusion about the risk from leaping all these other steps. And that's when I started to go out to industry and say, hey, it's okay if you want to be conservative in your remediation, but be aware that your report is actually also a risk communication document. And you haven't done any risk assessment. You've just found some asbestos in soil, and you haven't characterized that nor expressed that in terms of risk yet, really, because you haven't done those other steps that you need to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Look, that's my next question. So we've gone through the papers. The NEPM is at least 11 years old now.
Yes.
You have published papers, at least I read the paper, investigating further. We had Anna Sarah on the podcast. She has done some research. I know AECOM has done some research with Ross McFarland. Phil Hibbs was involved. We certainly have more data available now and more research available now.
Yes, but I think also better access. So one of the challenges initially was analytical methodology, but now there are much more available reference methods internationally that we could be using, with some of which I've put into the 21 guidelines. And NATA, a shift in NATA, which is the accreditation for laboratories for those looking for acronyms, a shift in the agency that accredits laboratories in their accreditation for asbestos methods, they're now allowing other methods that are suitable reference methods. So that's another shift that's happened since the NEPM.
Yeah. Can I just clarify when we go away from those 2 papers? So what amazed me is that the 1998 Addison paper and the Schwartzes and Trump paper, they did actually, although using quite different approaches to it, they did actually come up with similar results. That's, that 0.01% by weight of asbestos in soil, dry soil, seems to be a level that's kind of, in both of those, they found that, which is good, which is kind of an indication, hey, we are on the right track here. We then, and I want to make that perfectly clear here, and I hope I am right about this. We then in Australia said, okay, we have different types of soils in some states, and we have a lot of sun.
And we have crystalline, white and blue.
that's actually one thing that I like, where we said, look, let's not muck around with what type of asbestos we have. Can we just, asbestos is asbestos, the 3 or 4 types don't matter. I think that was a smart move in simplifying things. But we decided then in the NEPM, in our Bible, to say, okay, we divide the acceptable levels by a factor of 10. So we have already, both Addison and Schwartz came up with very conservative levels, very conservative. Remember the blowing air through dried soil?
Yes.
And we then decided, you know what, that's probably a good idea. Let's just make it even more conservative by a factor of 10. Am I right here?
Well, we didn't really make it more conservative per se. We just absented the additional calculation of timesing by 10 and trying to find asbestos fibre or level of moisture. But what we try and say in our guidelines is, if you go the next steps of assessment, you can add those things back in and go, well, we've only got chrysotile, we've got 10% moisture, we can have a site-specific criteria that's higher. But yes, I completely agree with the premise that we start at a very, very, very conservative level. So there's no way that you can say we found this in soil and there's a health risk, because as per all health screening levels that we use in the NEPM, we start at a very conservative base level and say, if you find this, everyone can move on from this site. There is no risk to health.
Okay.
That kind of brings us to another point. One thing that comes up a lot for us in New South Wales, at least, is the zero tolerance approach. And what I'm hearing is that the levels that we have set in the NEPM and in the WA guidance are extremely conservative. But we take it a step further here in New South Wales, and that there's an expectation, particularly in the waste sector, that materials have zero asbestos in it, and that means zero. So even detections that are below, 0.01 for bonded material. Does that ever come up in WA, or have you had much exposure to that argument around zero?
In WA for waste, we have set a criteria for waste with asbestos. I am anti the criteria setting. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, a little bit, if you set criteria, because you lose that qualitative assessment ability and it just becomes a tick cross, am I hitting this number in a sample?
Right.
And with waste, the important thing is those preliminary steps of separating your asbestos from the waste and trying to keep it out of that stream. And if you do that, you manage asbestos. And I don't want to lose the focus from what you should be doing with waste to, just approving waste because it has a criteria threshold in it. Having said that, we use the 0.001% weight by wet as validation for waste, but we do, again, with waste, include a set of guidelines that allows a step approach and qualitative assessment to be done.
Yeah.
That's in WA.
That's in WA. So you can look this up if you're interested. They're called the Construction and Demolition Waste. I probably got the title wrong. If you look up Construction and Demolition Waste Asbestos Guidelines WA, you'll probably find it. It's on our Environmental Agency website. They're currently being updated. But yeah, we do use that waste criteria and final validation of 0.001% weight by weight.
I was just going to say, is it the same for recycled products as well? That there's a threshold?
Yes, it's the same threshold that's used.
Right.
And there's a bit of a challenge in this because you can't sell or supply asbestos in WA and in most states.
Right.
So it becomes a product specification level to say this no longer contains asbestos, and we've validated that it doesn't, and this is our validation check that it doesn't contain asbestos.
It makes sense that it's tied back to the limit of reporting in the Australian standard laboratory method.
Yeah, although there isn't the limit of reporting in the Australian standard, it's a qualitative standard, so it doesn't. That was one of the challenges in setting a guideline level in Australia, was that doesn't actually go down to 0.001%.
Right.
So if you look at so we adopted the Schwartz and Trump approach, which is we actually looking at the whole amount of asbestos rather than just what can be found at a respirable fibre level.
Yes.
So we're counting all the bits and pieces and debris that you find in a bit of soil or material, and using that to create the percentage weight calculation, which this was really the important part of Swatches and Tromp that allowed us to write the guidelines with a 0.001% cutoff level, was this idea that we could include all of the non-friable asbestos as part of the gravimetric calculation. Swatches and Tromp, one of their steps is to just look at respirable fibres. And in effect, what I'd like consultants to do is that. So we look at what our total amount of bonded, because bonded is what we're dealing with here. We look at total amount of bonded as a percentage of the entire amount of material that we have. And then we can look at, well, is there any respirable fibres? As Australian standard tells us that to a 0.1 to 0.01% weight by weight limit for respirable fibre.
All right, we are already drifting into the right direction here. My next question for you is, so I go out on a contaminated site, and us contaminated sites consultants, our mind is mainly at the chemicals that we usually deal with. So on every site we analyze for heavy metals. On almost every site we analyze for petroleum hydrocarbons in their various forms. And that is where a contaminated site's person's mind generally is. Mm. And then suddenly we come across asbestos, and there you suddenly are thrown into an area that has a completely different skill set and set of knowledge requirements.
Yes.
You can be a very good chemically contaminated sites person, and a very good consultant and an expert in that area. And yet you can be very poor in the assessment of asbestos, because it is such a different skill set. It's such a different set of knowledge that's out there. Mm. Help me. Go out on a site, and how is a proper... So we find a couple of pieces of bonded asbestos in there. So we are still in the preliminary stage. It's enough for me to say, oops, now I would say we need to look at this, right? It's not just lying on the surface. That's a different game altogether. This is now part of the soil on the site. Mm. Now we need to look further. So the next step, what do? I know you are the expert. You wrote the section, that book in the Bible is yours. So tell me.
Well, we really push in WA that person does have the skills and competencies to identify asbestos. While most of the material on a site is bonded, if you don't know how to identify asbestos and know the myriad of asbestos products, you will miss the most dangerous ones because they are less common. So, and that happens. So your textile kind of products, which can be more friable, either your woven textile, asbestos blankets or rope insulation, often get missed. Like I'll walk onto a site and it's been completely missed by the consultant. So if you think about the other asbestos identifying, removal work or building inspections for registers, they have quite a bit of training on identifying asbestos. And I think consultants need that too. What's missing from reports is where's all the identifying data that says, I wasn't sure about this material, so I got it tested. And if it was me on that side, I'd have like a whole analytical report that is just picks something suspicious up and tested it. So, yeah, I think it's really important that the con-site person upskills in identifying asbestos on a site and doing its assessment. And certainly in WA, probably it's happened in other states too. In WA, I've really seen that happen with some very good consultants who really upskilled, especially if they have a hygiene section that's part of their consultancy as well. They've worked with them and they're really upskilled and are now much more knowledgeable about asbestos in soil than someone who does building inspection. I mean, the hilarious thing is they've come across products that building inspectors would never see because it's in waste material, like old ironing boards and things like that. So in a way that you have to even be more knowledgeable, because not only are you coming across products that assessors normally don't see, you're actually having to identify them when they're broken up and covered in soil. So you kind of almost have to be even more of an expert in identifying asbestos.
Yeah, that's not easy. You know what I just realized? There isn't really any proper training program for contaminated sites consultants as far as soil is concerned either. I have taken any course that you can possibly take on asbestos, and they are all building and built environment based. The removal of bonded asbestos has nothing to do with what I come across in my field, which is the removal of asbestos, bonded asbestos contaminated soil. Nothing.
Yeah.
Right? Then I've done the removal of friable asbestos course. I've done the asbestos supervisor course. All of these, yes, you get little bits here and there, but ultimately they are not designed to educate contaminated sites people. We find different things.
Well, if you design a course, I'm on board.
I just had the idea. That is actually something that is really missing.
I think Alga were looking at that for a little while, so maybe talk to them and see how far they got. Here in WA, the Australian Land Consultants Association have a little course that they do for new field technicians where they look at, when you do your soil bore recording of what you find.
Yeah.
They bring me in for a half an hour session, or one of my team in now, where we talk about the different, we basically do Asbestos 101, and we bring our little sample box of the kind of things you might find in soil that are beyond sort of your bonded asbestos cement material.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think we need one. I agree with you, essentially. I think we need training for environmental consultants that is specific to the work that they do.
Uh-huh.
One thing that I was hoping to ask about, on a site, if you assume that you went ahead and you had to go forward with a sampling program, the testing method that's outlined in the WA guidelines, where we take a 10-litre sample in the field and then run a separate 500 ml sample through laboratory analysis. There are times where I've seen people taking 500 ml samples without the 10-litre field analysis. In your view, Pierina, the two go hand in hand, or do they have value being done separately?
I think they should be done separately. So in essence, because I think what you need to do is you establish your sampling data objectives and say, I have a bonded asbestos cement, hard asbestos cement problem,
Yep.
And in which case only the 10 litres is really relevant.
Okay.
And then, or I have, some loose materials here, in which case probably only the 500 is relevant, because you're trying to delineate the extent of your friable contamination.
Right.
And the limits of those concentrations to delineate your area. My preference is you take a separate sample, because if you're sieving the 10-litre sample, you've now diluted and mixed your soil layer.
Yeah.
So we say in our guidelines, which I don't think is really spelled out in the NEPM, but in the WA guidelines, we very much emphasise your 500 mils has to be representative. So you need to be taking it from a specific soil layer, specific location. So it gives you information about that soil layer.
Yeah.
And you can make judgments then about that. And you would be looking at that if you've got highly crushed or pulverized non-friable material, because something has happened for that to happen, or it's burnt or it's crushed in some way, or if you've got friable type material.
Right. Yeah.
I tend to, so I do the 10-litre samples, and I find 10 litres just not enough. That I find that because the moment you find a little piece of asbestos, you're over, right? So I then tend to, in my SAQPs, I say, here's how I'm going to skin this cat. We're going to take 10-litre samples. If a bonded piece of asbestos makes it into my bucket, that only triggers me to take at least 2 more 10-litre samples in the immediate vicinity. That triggers that immediately.
Yes.
Because then I have at least 30 liters, which is about 45 kilos of soil, because then I have a bigger sampling mass and to calculate my concentrations out. I can't really reliably and economically do that on every sampling point, because sometimes you go out and you have 50, 60, 80 trenches. It's just, it takes so long to sieve these. So, but the moment I find a piece, I take 2 more. That's just the bottom line of it. And I then divide the concentrations by the entire amount that I had. That's the first thing. And the second thing I do is I only take separate 500 ml samples if, number 1, I found bonded asbestos, and number 2, that was in terrible shape. Am I on the right track here?
Yes, I think you're on the right track. And exactly sort of what we were pointing to before, if you're trying to characterize the nature and extent of contamination, you need to take often more than one sample. And one hit doesn't make or break a site in terms of exceeding the screening value. You take that sample data result and you put that together with all the other information you have, and then you make a judgment as to whether or not this site or this area of investigation passes or fails. I actually think the ability to do field analysis kind of helps you, because if you're doing chemicals, you've got to wait for the lab result to then take multiple samples. But this is where having a person who's competent on the site as part of the investigations when there's asbestos really comes into its own, because you can make judgments right then and there. I need to take 3 more samples of this spot. You do it, you characterize that, here's your hot spot, and you can write your management plan as you go, like essentially from that perspective. So you can it can be an iterative process. You can make decisions based on what you're finding and get results straight away about the extent of the contamination, which is, I think, brilliant.
It is. And here's reality. Reality and commercial pressures hit.
Yeah, okay.
A very experienced, highly experienced environmental consultant with knowledge in assessment of contaminated sites and good knowledge in asbestos, which we know is difficult and have established is difficult to come by.
Mm-hmm.
That person is expensive. There are few, they're very senior people. You can't often, hardly ever can you afford to send someone of that level of experience out into the field and spend 4 days sieving freaking samples with, okay, you have some juniors with you, but you can't afford that unless you have a $500 million lawsuit at your hand. Yeah, then suddenly things become available. But that's why, and I know exactly how it happens, because the pressures are there. You put a sampling, an SAQP, a sampling analysis and quality control plan together, and you send, I shouldn't call them juniors, but definitely not senior and principal level people out into the field and say, this, buddy, is how you assess this site, and come back to me and tell me what you found. And there's just no way that these people are of a level that would be required to do the assessment that you just spoke about in the field, right? When I go out in the field, and I still sometimes do, when I go out in the field, I mean, from the moment I set foot on that site, I'm already starting to write my report. Mm. And I'm thinking, do I have enough data to write this report? And if not, I better collect it now. But that is something that comes with a lot of fieldwork and a lot of time and an enormous amount of reading, writing reports and reading other people's reports. Mm. This isn't, I know it's so easy to say, oh, well, you're a consultant, you should know. Yes, we should.
Mm. Yeah, and the only way we can fast track that experience and knowledge is through training, and we're missing that ability to do that because there isn't a training course that is specific for our field technicians that work in contaminated sites.
Yeah.
I have strong faith in the interest of the contaminated sites field technicians, because having said that, because I train them, so I know they're keen, and I know they can do this and be trusted to do more than they do, but they need that training. They need the benefit of our experience explained to them so that they don't have to do this slowly over 3 years. We can give them like a year of knowledge in one training session, if we do it well. So, I think training competency is critical,
For sure, Pierina. I think it kind of almost brings us back to one of the first points you made, which is how people, when presented with a number or a limit, tend to want to grab onto that limit and sort of use it in a black and white way. And I definitely think that people's level of comfort with and people's level of experience with dealing with these sorts of things can definitely influence how comfortable they are moving away into that tier 2, site-specific risk assessment world. And so I'm with you. I think that, the idea, I guess, is to continue to upskill people so that we can look at this stuff with a little bit more nuance and not just look at it in a black and white way. Because, my personal opinion is also that we tend to get a little bit too kind of put in a box based on these numbers, and we lose a bit of the a lot of the good background that you've explained to us today.
Yeah, and I think we have, with the WA guidelines, and with our consultants here, we try to have a bit of an open door policy. So now they're quite skilled at being able to do those kind of secondary qualitative assessments. New consultancies here, and we have quite a bit more leeway in our guidelines around. You look, 500 mils or 10 litres isn't working for you. We're happy for you to use a different quantity, just justify your reason and your decision making. And I think what consultants start to accept when they do that and they see that their report passes is that, actually we are amenable to you doing that thinking and that assessment, provided that it's all in that report and we know we can walk through that decision making with you and understand why you did what you did.
Why did you move over to New South Wales? Come on. Grab your family and come over.
Sure. I did an ASTM conference, which was amazing. I learned so much. But I also presented, which was daunting. But I ended up talking to a consultant, environmental consultant from Japan, and he was saying in their environmental agency that people change every 2 years. So just as they learn about asbestos, they leave and go to a different job. And he's going, it'd be wonderful to have a regulator who kind of is actually a specialist in the field. so we're a bit luckier in Australia in that we tend to have specialists in roles.
I'm keen to understand, because you're not working in the asbestos space right now. Is that right, Pierina?
I'm not working in the contaminated sites space, but certainly still doing a lot of asbestos related policy work. We have public health asbestos regulations in WA, which I get involved with assisting local government, emergency response type work. So asbestos is, I think, always going to be a part of my career in one way or another.
Yeah, I was going to ask you sort of what's next for you, like sort of what are your priorities at the moment that you're looking ahead to?
I guess for me, I'm enjoying doing my senior toxicology role at the moment here at Department of Health. I get to do a lot of different health risk assessment. I enjoy doing health risk assessment, and and it's all about health risk assessment and risk communication, which are things that I really enjoy doing. And the good thing about my role is I could be assessing any contaminant, and it could be in air, water, soil, food. And it makes it quite interesting and dynamic. Yeah, I'm enjoying it.
Well, that's great. Great to hear.
One very last thing, Pierina. Before James and I before we started this podcast, we sat down and made a list of potential guests we want to have, and it's a long list. But I just had brought that sheet up here, and it says, we need to talk to Pierina on being one of the most amazing, trailblazing, and yet approachable regulators. That's what we wrote down before we had even started this podcast. So, thank you for being the most amazing, trailblazing, and yet approachable regulator. It's been such a pleasure.
I think I'm traveling behind other people that have been trailblazers like Swartz and Tromp. John Howell here in WA, who was brave enough to set a limit. I follow other trailblazers.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll add humble to the list now as well.
And I do want to say the approachable part is definitely very important, because not everyone is approachable, Pierina. So someone like you being willing to share your knowledge and obviously the way that you interact with your regulated community in WA, I think is to be applauded, because not everywhere is like that.
Yeah, I think it's important though. If you want to, it's that training thing, right? If you want to see change in the industry, it's got to be a two-way conversation rather than, because then the reports that come back are better and the process is streamlined.
Thank you. When you are next in Sydney, I'm sure you come over now and then, right?
Every now and then, yeah.
We will be there with cheerleaders' outfits and cheering for you.
Thanks, guys. And I really appreciate you guys doing this podcast and helping spread awareness and messages, because that is actually a really difficult thing to do.
Thanks, Pierina.
Bye, Pierina. We let you go.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, guys. Bye.